2 stars shine bright. The phone, still warm from Dean's grip, felt like a lead weight in Frank's hand. He stared at the receiver, the dial tone a shrill accusation in the sudden quiet of his hospital room. "I'm done, Frank." 4 words. 4 brutal, definitive words that had just obliterated 5 decades of shared laughter, whispered secrets, and boozy brotherhood. He slammed the receiver back into its cradle, the plastic clatter echoing the tremor in his own hand. "What was that, Frank?" Barbara's voice was soft, laced with concern, but he barely registered it. He was already jabbing at the keypad, redialing Dean's number. Ring, ring, ring. And then the flat, impersonal voice of the answering machine. He hung up, a raw sound escaping his throat. He tried again, and again. The nurses, bustling in and out with their hushed efficiency, cast worried glances his way. His frustration escalated with each unanswered call, each mechanical chime of the voicemail. 47 times. He counted them, the numbers a desperate tally of his dissolving world. He pictured Dean, propped up in his own bed, the phone perhaps just out of reach, or worse, ignored. The thought twisted a knot in his gut. "He's probably just resting, darling," Barbara ventured, placing a cool hand on his feverish forehead. "He's been through a lot." "He's done, Barbara," Frank rasped, the words tasting like ash. He said he's done. The memory of Dean's weary, defeated tone. So, unlike the jovial croon he knew, haunted him. He remembered the last time they'd truly talked. Not about a gig or a contract, but about Dino Jr. Frank, in his usual bluster, had tried to rally him. "Come on, the show must go on, Dag. Dino would have wanted you on stage." He'd meant it to be a push, a halt back to life. But now, he saw the flicker of something akin to betrayal in Dean's eyes. A flicker he'd dismissed, too focused on the next performance, the next roar of the crowd. Days bled into weeks. The hospital discharge felt like a reprieve, but the emptiness in his life only deepened. He sent flowers, expensive wines, even a handwritten letter. Each gift, each carefully penned word, returned unopened, unread. He saw newspaper headlines speculating about their rift, heard the whispers on the street. "The Rat Pack's broken," they said. He knew it was true, and the realization was a dull ache that never truly subsided. Months later, standing at the edge of the grave, the cold autumn wind whipped at his suit. The scent of damp earth and wilting flowers hung heavy in the air. The casket, polished to a dark sheen, seemed to absorb all the light. He leaned down, his voice a hoarser murmur, lost amidst the hushed sobs of mourners. "I should have listened, Dag." The words were for Dean, for their lost friendship, and for the echoes of a past he could never reclaim. He stood there for a long time, the weight of a lifetime of regret pressing down on him. The golden era, the dressing room air, thick with the ghosts of forgotten vices, clung to Dean like a shroud. Another city, another stage door, another mirror reflecting a man etched with weariness under the cruel glare of overhead lights. His hand, a tremor running through it, reached for the receiver. This wasn't a familiar late-night call to Sammy, or a casual chat with Joey. This was a farewell. "Frank," he rasped, his voice a frayed whisper of its former resonance. From the other end, Frank's booming voice, usually a balm, struck him like a blow. Dean almost tasted the clinking ice, heard the low thrum of background chatter. Frank, holding court, blissfully unaware. "Dag, you old dog, trying to duck out of Vegas? What is this, another one of your disappearing acts? Come on, the show must go on, you know that." The cheer was brittle, edged with the same steel Dean had come to despise. The cheer was brittle. Reactions. The show must go on, Frank's unwavering creed. His blanket solution for every human sorrow, every personal abyss. Dean's jaw clenched. He closed his eyes, a phantom H blossoming in his chest. Dino Jr.'s vibrant, laughing face flickered in his mind's eye, then dissolved into the stark void of his absence. Frank couldn't fathom it. Couldn't. The grief was a physical burden, crushing his lungs, making the very thought of a spotlight anathema. He couldn't force the upbeat melodies, couldn't play the charmer, couldn't pretend. Not anymore. I'm done, Frank. The words, barely audible, sliced through the static, through decades of shared laughter and liquor-laced promises. A pregnant silence descended, heavier than any outburst. Dean pictured Frank, mid-sentence, glass poised, his brow furrowed in baffled confusion. Then, a sharp click. Dean ended the call. The phone, a leaden weight, settled back into its cradle. The room's sudden quiet was profound, broken only by the faint thrum of the air conditioning. He met his reflection, a stranger gazing back. Older, more profoundly spent than he'd ever permitted himself to appear. The golden era, he knew, had concluded, and he was at last irrevocably alone. Each insistent ring a jagged splinter of sound, tearing at the fragile peace he had just claimed. He let it keen 47 times, until the relentless chirping finally yielded to a blessed hush. He knew it was Frank, knew the apologies, the arguments, the subtle cajoling that would inevitably follow. But Dean had nothing left to give. The wellspring had run dry. The stage stood empty. Years later, at Dean's funeral, Frank stood by the closed casket, a stoic silhouette in the dim chapel light, with the spectral echoes of songs that would remain unsung. Frank leaned in, his voice a raw murmur, barely carrying above the rustle of programs. I should have listened. Dag. The only response was the cold, immutable silence of the wood. The leader takes hold. The phone, still warm from Dean's hand, lay on the crisp white hospital sheet, like a discarded thought. The sterile air, usually a constant hum, felt suddenly amplified by the silence. Dr. Evans, a man whose bedside manner was as polished as his silver hair, had just given Dean the grim prognosis. Dean hadn't flinched, hadn't argued. He'd simply picked up the receiver. Now, as the doctor left a fleeting shadow across the doorway, Dean stared at the instrument. 4 words. That's all it took to sever a 50-year tether. His chest ached, a pain that had nothing to do with the failing organs inside him. It was the echo of a friendship, a brotherhood, now fractured beyond repair. He saw Frank's face, not the gaunt, worried one from their last strained visit, but the vibrant, audacious leader of their younger days. Frank, always pushing, always demanding, always believing in the relentless momentum of the show. His hand trembled as he reached for the bedside table, a faint tremor running through him. The glass of water, condensation beading on its surface, seemed to mock his parched throat. He closed his eyes, the memory of Dino Jr.'s laugh, so vibrant, so full of promise, filling his mind. Then, Frank's dismissive voice, a careless wave of his hand. Come on, the show must go on. The words had felt like a physical blow, a betrayal of unspoken understanding. Dean had been drowning in grief, and Frank had offered him a stage. The phone rang, a shrill, insistent demand in the quiet room. Dean flinched, his eyes snapping open. He knew who it was. He let it ring, 47 times, a relentless symphony of Frank's regret. Each jangling peal was a chisel, carving deeper into the wall Dean had erected around himself. He pictured Frank pacing his opulent living room. The phone pressed to his ear, his brow furrowed with confusion. Then anger, then perhaps a flicker of understanding. Later, as the nurses bustled in and out, performing their quiet, efficient duties, Dean felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. The decision was made. The connection, once electric. He looked out the window at the hazy Los Angeles skyline, the city lights beginning to twinkle like fallen stars. He had given Frank everything he had, every joke, every song, every late-night confession. But there was one thing he couldn't give. his forgiveness for the unacknowledged sorrow, for the relentless drive that had overshadowed his own humanity. He was done, and in that final, definitive act, he felt a strange, quiet power. The leader had finally taken hold, not of the stage, but of his own ending. A shadow falls. The sterile white of the hospital room felt like a spotlight, harsh and unforgiving. Dean's eyes, usually sparkling with mischievous humour, were now dulled by an exhaustion that went bone deep. His hand, frail and mottled with age, each movement was a monumental effort. He'd been staring at the phone for what felt like an hour, the plastic cool against his clammy palm. The nurses were gone, a temporary reprieve from the incessant prodding and hushed consultations. This was his moment, a quiet rebellion. He punched in the familiar number, the rhythmic beeps, echoing in the silent room. A single cough rasped from his chest, tasting of stale air and regret. The line clicked. A voice, sharp and instantly recognizable, answered. "Yeah, Frank here." Dean closed his eyes, a tremor running through him, the weight of 50 years, of shared stages and whispered secrets, of boozy nights and triumphant mornings, pressed down. He thought of Dino, his son, gone too soon, a chasm of grief that Frank had, with a casual wave of his hand, dismissed as a mere inconvenience to their carefully orchestrated comeback. "The show must go on, Dean," Frank had said, his voice devoid of understanding, devoid of empathy. It had been the final bitter drop in an overflowing cup. He took a slow, deliberate breath, the words forming on his tongue, heavy and final. "I'm done, Frank." He didn't wait for a reply, didn't need one. With a decisive click, he returned the receiver to its cradle. The silence that followed was profound, deeper than any he'd known. It wasn't empty. It was full of an aching, hard-won peace. He laid his head back against the crisp pillow, the tension bleeding from his shoulders. The phone beside him buzzed, then rang, a frantic, insistent sound. He ignored it. It rang again, and again. It rang 47 times. It sang its frantic, unanswered song before finally falling silent. Across town, Frank Sinatra slammed the phone down, the sharp crack echoing in his opulent study. His face was a mask of disbelief, then a slow-burning fury. He snarled at the empty air. He snatched up the receiver again, his fingers jabbing at the speed dial. Busy. He tried again. Still busy. A cold dread began to worm its way into his gut. Dean never hung up. Not like that. Not ever. Frank called again and again, the unanswered rings mocking him with every persistent chime. The uncharacteristic silence from the other end of the line was a void he couldn't fill. The phone, still warm from Dean's grasp, tumbled from his fingers, landing with a soft thud on the hospital's pristine white sheet. Overhead, the fluorescent lights hummed a grating counterpoint to the H behind his eyes. He fixed his gaze on the stark ceiling, a blank canvas for the torrent of memories now assailing him. Frank, forever the provocateur, the ringleader, the one who'd pulled him from countless smoky clubs. Frank, who'd built an empire, then, brick by careful brick, dismantled the edifice of their friendship. Dean's eyelids fluttered shut, conjuring Dino Jr.'s laughing face. The last time he'd genuinely witnessed that joy was before the plane crash, before the world had leached of its colour, and Frank's unyielding mantra of the show had become a cruel, echoing taunt. A tremor ran through his hand, a phantom echo of the shakes that had seized him since the news. Frank's words, sharp and unyielding, sliced through the quiet room. "Come on, Dean. The show must go on." Each syllable a fresh laceration. A nurse, her eyes kind but weary, glided in, her movements a hushed ballet. She adjusted his IV line with a gentle touch. Dean offered a fleeting, practiced smile, a muscle memory from a lifetime under spotlights. But the warmth never reached his gaze. The performance was over. No more forced cheer. No more haze-filled rooms. No more endless parade of strangers. He was done with Frank. Beside him, the phone began to vibrate. A persistent buzz against the fabric. Dean kept his eyes closed. The caller ID, though unseen, burned into his mind. He let it ring and ring again. Each unanswered summons was a small victory, a reclamation of the silence Frank had so callously shattered. He pictured Frank pacing his opulent suite, the phone clamped to his ear, his brow furrowed first in bewilderment, then in fury. For once, Frank wouldn't dictate the outcome. For once, Frank wouldn't have the final word. The silence stretched, a heavy, comforting shroud. He was, at last, truly off the stage. Back on stage, broken heart. The stage lights hit Frank like a physical blow, a scorching reminder of a spotlight he'd once craved above all else. Tonight, it felt like an interrogation. The orchestra struck up "My Way," a cruel irony. He'd lived his life his way, all right, and it had cost him everything. Dean's absence was a gaping hole in the fabric of the night, a silence louder than the applause. He saw it in the bewildered faces of the audience, the subtle glances from the band, all expecting Dean to saunter out with a martini and a wry joke. His voice, usually a velvet caress, felt raspy, worn down by nights of restless regret. Each lyric, a testament to his own stubbornness, twisted in his gut. Regrets. I've had a few. He locked eyes with the front row, imagining Dean, perpetually cool, raising an eyebrow in mock disapproval. The memory was a fresh wound. After the first set, he retreated to his dressing room, the familiar scent of stale cigar smoke and cheap cologne clinging to the air. The mirror showed a man aged beyond his years, the laugh lines around his eyes now etched with sorrow. A half-empty bottle of Jack Daniels sat on the counter. He stared at it, a phantom echo of Dean's easygoing presence. He reached for the phone, his fingers hovering over the familiar numbers, a practiced ritual from decades past. But the memory of that final, clipped, "I'm done, Frank," froze his hand. The receiver felt like a lead weight. "Frank, you're on," a stagehand announced, his voice muffled through the door. The sting a momentary distraction from the dull ache in his chest. Back on stage, he launched into "Come Fly With Me," his usual swagger replaced by a forced bravado. He saw a couple in the third row, swaying gently, their eyes full of admiration. He used to thrive on that. Now it felt like a spotlight on his failure. He could almost hear Dean's quiet judgment, a whisper in the back of his mind. "You really gonna push this, Dag?" He clenched his jaw, the mic stand digging into his palm. Yet all he heard was the echo of a disconnected phone. The sterile scent of disinfectant clung to Dean's hospital gown, a stark contrast to the familiar aroma of whiskey and stale cigarette smoke that usually defined his world. The phone felt like a foreign object, heavy and cold in his trembling hand. He stared at the worn, familiar number, etched into his memory like a lyric. Across the room, a nurse adjusted his IV drip, her movements hushed and respectful. He knew she pitied him, saw the broken man beneath the facade. He took a slow, deliberate breath, the air burning in his chest. His gaze drifted to the window, where the LA skyline shimmered with the indifferent glitter of 1,000 distant stars. Dino was out there somewhere, a part of that vast, uncaring expanse now. No, the thought was a raw, jagged wound in his soul. The line connected. A click, then the familiar booming voice, laced with an immediate, almost frantic energy. "Diano, you finally picked up, you old lug. What's with all the radio silence? I've been worried sick. You sound like hell, by the way. Get your ass out of that bed. We've got a gig in Vegas next week. Crowds champing at the bit. You know, the show must go on and all that jazz." Frank's words tumbled out, a torrent of self-absorption, completely oblivious to the chasm that had opened between them. Dean closed his eyes, picturing Frank's animated face. The way his hands would gesticulate wildly when he spoke. He saw the shared stages, the laughter, the camaraderie that had once felt like an impenetrable fortress. But that fortress had crumbled, brick by painful brick, under the weight of Frank's unyielding demands. His insistence on a version of Dean that no longer existed. The show must go on had been the final, brutal shove, pushing him over the edge of a cliff he'd been clinging to for months. He opened his mouth, the words catching in his throat. He swallowed, tasting ash. Then, with a clarity that surprised even himself, he spoke, his voice hoarse but firm. Dean didn't wait for a reply, didn't allow himself to be drawn back into the familiar dance of persuasion and capitulation. He pressed the red button, severing the connection, the click echoing in the quiet room like a gunshot. The phone slipped from his grasp, landing with a soft thud on the pristine white sheet. He felt a strange lightness, a hollow H where the burden had been. Later, the nurse found him staring blankly at the wall, the phone vibrating ceaselessly on the bedside table. "Mr. Sinatra," she murmured, her brow furrowed with concern. He just continued to gaze, unseeing, at the pale yellow paint. The ringing stopped, only to begin again moments later. 47 times it rang before the night ended, each unanswered call a hammer blow against the fragile peace he had finally found. The silent years. The phone, cold and heavy in his hand, felt like a dead weight. Frank stared at the receiver, the dial tone a mocking, endless drone in his ear. 47 calls, 47 attempts to mend a chasm that had opened with 4 simple words. "I'm done, Frank." The click that followed still echoed in the cavern of his memory, sharp and final. He paced the opulent living room, the Persian rug feeling rough beneath his polished shoes. The scent of stale cigar smoke clung to the heavy velvet drapes. Dean, his Dean, had never been one for dramatics. That was Frank's domain. Dean's anger, when it came, was a slow burn, a quiet withdrawal. And this withdrawal, this was different. This was absolute. "He's not answering, Frank." Jilly Risso's voice was soft, laced with a pity Frank couldn't stomach. Maybe give him some space. Space. That's what he'd given Dean when Dino Jr. died. Died. Space in the sense of a stage to stand on, a microphone to hold. Come on, the show must go on. The words tasted like ash now, bitter on his tongue. He'd meant them as a lifeline, a way back to normalcy, to the only thing they both knew. The roar of the crowd, the bright lights. He hadn't seen the raw wound, the gaping hole in Dean's soul. He'd seen a schedule, a commitment, a goddamn show. Weeks bled into months. The silence from Dean's end became a palpable presence, heavier than any argument, louder than any shouted word. Frank tried everything. Flowers, expensive wines, even a signed baseball from Sandy Koufax. A gift he knew Dean would appreciate. One the stark white envelope accompanying it, sometimes with a curt return to sender. One blustery afternoon, he drove past Dean's estate, the gates like an iron curtain. The sprawling lawn, usually meticulously kept, seemed a little wilder, the roses untamed. He imagined Dean inside, maybe playing golf on his private putting green, or just staring at the television, a drink in his hand. But the image was a phantom. The Dean he knew, the one who'd finish his sentences, who'd laugh at his darkest jokes, was gone, replaced by a ghost haunting the edges of his own memory. The silence grew, a vast and unforgiving sear between them. Frank, the man who thrived on connection, on camaraderie, found himself adrift. The laughter at his dinner parties felt hollow. The applause for his performances, once exhilarating, now seemed to mock the emptiness inside him. He'd pushed too hard. He'd demanded too much. He'd thought their bond was unbreakable. a steel cable woven through 50 years of shared triumphs and whispered secrets. He'd been wrong. It was a fragile thread, and he, in his arrogance, had snapped it. The regret was a constant, dull ache, a phantom limb he'd lost but still felt throbbing. The oppressive quiet of the funeral home chapel pressed down on Frank, a physical weight heavier than the gold signet ring on his pinky. He'd seen countless such rooms, performed in them even, but never one that felt so hollow. The scent of lilies, cloying and sweet, mixed with the faint disinfectant smell, doing little to mask the raw absence in the air. Dean's casket, polished mahogany, gleamed under the soft, diffused light, an unyielding barrier to the man he'd known for half a century. He watched the stream of faces, some familiar, some vaguely so, as they offered hushed condolences to Jeannie and the children. Each sympathetic murmur felt like a tiny, accusing needle. He'd tried to call again this morning, the Quarenta y Ochoth attempt since that final, brutal click. The line rang empty, a mocking echo of his own desperation. As the chapel emptied, a quiet command from Nancy, he found himself alone, save for a single, shadowed security guard by the double doors. The silence was deafening now, broken only by the distant hum of the building's ventilation. He approached the casket slowly, each step feeling monumental. His tailored suit suddenly too tight, too formal for this raw, exposed moment. He stopped a foot away, the smooth wood reflecting his own tormented face back at him, distorted and aged. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers brushing the cool, unyielding surface. He imagined Dean inside, forever still, forever silent. The finality of it all was a punch to the gut. The words he'd rehearsed, the desperate pleas he'd whispered into his phone night after night, died on his tongue. What was the use now? The stage was empty, the audience gone. Then, a quiet, guttural sound escaped him. A whisper barely audible above his own ragged breathing. "I should have listened, Dag." The old nickname, a vestige of shared laughter and countless late nights, felt like a burning ember in his throat. He leaned closer, his forehead almost touching the cool wood. I was so wrong, pal. So damn wrong." His voice cracked, raw with a grief that had festered into an open wound. He stood there for a long moment, the weight of a lifetime of unspoken words pressing down, a heavy shroud. The only answer was the impenetrable silence of the casket and the chilling realization that some conversations, once abandoned, can never truly be resumed.